Welcome to Buildbox 3.1. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create a simple jump avoidance game. The objective of this game will be to make the players navigate through a narrow path, avoiding obstacles while collecting objects as points. At the end of this lesson, you will know the basics on how to use the tools inside Buildbox to create characters, enemies, and obstacles. When you are ready, fire up Buildbox and let's get started. So once we have Buildbox open and are greeted with the welcome screen here, let's go ahead and get started by clicking Create New at the top left over here. For our project, let's go ahead and click Create Empty since we want to start with a fresh slate. Now that our project is created and we're in the mind map right here, the next thing we want to do is we want to give our game a name as well as set the orientation that the game is going to be played in. To do that, let's go ahead and click the gear icon at the top right over here to open up the project settings. After that, let's go ahead and replace Untitled with Jump Avoidance. And after that, let's go ahead and change our orientation from portrait to landscape. And once we are done, let's go ahead and click OK. Now we are ready to start editing and populating our 2D world. To open the 2D world, simply just double click the 2D world in the mind map over here, and this will open the world's scene editor. And to move around and navigate, simply hold down your spacebar until the mouse turns into a little white glove, then click and drag in any direction to move your view around the scene. You can also scroll up with your mouse wheel to zoom in, and then scroll down with your mouse wheel to zoom out. So before we start building our level out, let's go ahead and adjust our start and end points. To do so, click to select the square shape, which is our start point, then use the green handle to drag it up the y-axis so that it's roughly center on the grid. Next, I'm going to go ahead and use the rotate tool here and drag it along so that it's facing the right side of our screen. And now I'm going to use the red handle to pull it to the left along the x-axis. Next, I'm going to take my endpoint and I'm going to drag it from the center and I'm going to move it over to the opposite area. I'm going to use the rotate tool once more so that it's pointed to the right side of the screen. And I'm going to use the green arrow to bring it down a little bit. So now that I have a rough position and rotation of the start and end points, I'm going to go ahead and enter exact numbers into the axis values on the right. So with the endpoint selected, I'm going to go ahead and navigate to the right hand side, and I'm going to set the position X value to 11. Next, I can push Tab to highlight the Y value, and I'm going to set this to 0. Hit Tab again to go to the rotation, and since it's at roughly -89, I'm going to set that to -90. So now we have exact measurements on where our endpoint is. So let's go ahead and do the same thing to the start point. I'm going to select the start point, highlight the X value, and I'm going to say -11. Tab to highlight the Y value, I'm going to set that to 0. And rotation, once again, -90. And with that, we are finally ready to start populating our scene with assets. To do so, let's go ahead and click on our asset library at the top left-hand corner. So you can double click and choose any of these assets that you wish to represent as your ground, but I'm going to go ahead and be plain and boring and double click this rectangle right here. And you'll notice that it's now added to our asset panel. To go back to our scene editor, click the asset library button once more. And next, what we want to do is we want to give our rectangle a name. So to do that, let's go ahead and click on our rectangle in the asset panel. And on the right, where it says name, let's go ahead and replace rectangle with ground. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to give this ground some color. And to do this, you can simply click the color attribute here to bring up the color window. And I'm going to go ahead and choose an orange color, then click OK once I'm finished. Now just in case you're using an older version of Buildbox or would rather upload a 3D model to this asset, you will need to give this asset a 3D model node. So in the asset panel, let's double click on our ground and this will open up the ground's node map. To navigate in the node map, you can use your middle mouse to click and drag in any direction, just like we did in the mind map earlier. You can click any node to select it, and you can click and drag them in any direction to move them around the grid. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this animation node and press delete on my keyboard to get rid of it. And what that does is it gets rid of the plain white image that was attached to our asset. And now we can go ahead and add our 2D plane. To do this, simply navigate to the node panel and expand the content category. Next, let's click and drag a 3D model node into the node panel next to the start node. Now, from the created output of the start node, click and drag out a connection line and drop it on top of the enabled input of the 3D model node. Now that we have our 3D model node attached, we need to select what kind of mesh we want our asset to have. So in the options panel on the right and in the mesh square, click the edit button in the corner to bring up the mesh manager. Next, on the left side of the mesh manager, click to select the plane, then click save at the bottom right. Now we can finally change the color of our mesh. To do this, click the area next to the color attribute to bring up the colors window. From here, go ahead and select an orange color, then click OK to close the colors window. Now, before we go back to our scene editor, there's just one more thing we have to do. In the rotation attribute, set the x-axis to 90. This will rotate the plane so that it will be facing our camera and match our game's perspective. Now that we have added our plane and have applied color to our plane, we can go back to our scene editor by clicking 2D World on the navigation bar at the top. I'm just going to center our view just a bit, and now we are ready to add our ground to the scene. So let's do this by dragging our ground from the asset panel and dropping it into our scene. Now from here, we can resize and change the shape of our asset by clicking any of these points and dragging them in their respective direction. So here I'm going to take this point and I'm going to make this asset a little bit longer. Take the other point and I'm going to do the same thing. And to move it, all you have to do is click and drag this in any direction to move it across the grid. So I'm going to set my first ground asset to be the ceiling, which is going to be placed around here. The next thing I want to do now that I have my ceiling is I want to create my floor. Now the easiest way to do this is just pressing S on your keyboard to duplicate the asset down. So now I can go ahead and take my floor and move it roughly down here. So since I have a rough estimate as to the position and size of our ceiling and floor, we can be a bit more precise on the position and scale values. So with our ceiling selected, let's move over to the options panel and let's set our position X value to 0. Go ahead and press tab on your keyboard and set our Y value to 11. We can leave the rotation value to 0, but on our scale X value, let's set that to 11. And we can leave the scale Y value to 1. Now I'm going to go ahead and select our floor and do the exact same thing. Position X is going to be set to 0, position Y -11, rotation left at 0, scale X will be set to 11, and scale Y will be set to 1. Alright, and just like that we already have our floor and ceiling set up. So the next thing we want to create is our character, which is exactly what our player is going to control during our game. To do this, I'm going to show you a really quick way to create another asset. In the asset panel, go ahead and select the ground asset, then press D on your keyboard to duplicate it. This just created an exact copy of our ground, so now all we have to do is select our new asset, then navigate to the options panel and rename it to Player. Next, since this asset already has a 3D model node attached, we could just click to expand the 3D model tab, then click the color attribute to bring up the color window once more. This time, I'm going to select a yellow color, then click OK once I'm finished. Now it's time to go ahead and bring it into our scene. So for our character, I'm going to have it start at the dead center of our scene. So from here, I'm going to go straight to the position X and Y, and I'm going to go ahead and set both of those to 0. As for the scale and rotation, I'm going to keep those to their default values for now. So in order for our game to recognize this asset as a character, we're going to go into the asset panel on the left, and we're going to click and drag the player asset into the characters category. And what this does is it labels the asset as a character. The next thing we have to do to set up our level is adjust our game camera. To do this, go ahead and select the little camera icon in the scene editor and set its position X and Y value to 0. To preview our game camera, we can click the little camera icon in our toolbar at the very top, and this will give us an exact view of what the players will see during our game. So right now, as you can see, the camera is a little too close to our character at the moment. So we can actually fix this by scrolling down with our mouse wheel until the floor and ceiling come into view. And once we are satisfied with that, we can just click the camera button once more. And we are now back into our editing view. So now that we're satisfied with the camera view, the next thing we want to do is get our character to start moving forward when the game starts. So let's start by selecting our player asset in the asset panel. And over in the options panel, if you look at the very bottom, you'll see a big button that says Add Buildbox. If we click it, we have a clear list of all kinds of different functionalities we can go ahead and add to our asset. The one we're going to add right now is Move. And if I click to select this Buildbox, you will notice that its attributes appear in the options panel. So in order for us to test this out, we can hit the little play button at the very top to preview our game. And as you can see, our asset is now moving along the X-axis. Now for preview, I like to click the drop down at the top left, and I like to select 1920 by 1080 Full HD. This will give us a proper aspect ratio, and so it doesn't take up a lot of our screen, I usually like to set it to 50%. And this gives us a clear view and allows us to continue editing as well. For example, I can see our movement is a bit slow. So I'm going to go ahead and change that by going over to the speed attribute in the options panel next to move, and I'm going to go ahead and change it to 20. And now to preview this change, all I have to do is hit the refresh button right here, and now our asset is moving much faster. However, right now there's only one problem. Our character completely left us. So the next thing we have to do is we got to make the camera follow the player. To do that, let's start by closing the preview window, and if we select our camera in the outliner right here, then in the options panel next to position follow, we can click and select our character. Keep in mind that only assets labeled as characters will appear in this drop down right here for the camera to follow. So on that note, let's go ahead and select player and let's preview it once more. And as you can see, our camera is now following our player. Now that we added movement to our character, let's go ahead and create another scene. Now the easiest way to do this is to select the start scene right here and pressing D on your keyboard. This created an exact replica of your start scene. Now the first thing I'm going to do is rename our new scene by going into the options panel and replacing start with 1. Now one thing you'll notice about this new scene is that it duplicated everything over, including our character. Now what this means is our character now lives in 2 different scenes. And what this will result in if I hit preview, we now have 2 characters that the camera is trying to follow, and some weird things tend to happen. So to prevent this, whenever you duplicate a scene, you need to delete the character from that new scene. Now that we have at least one more new scene, let's go ahead and start adding physics and collisions to our assets. So in order for gravity to affect our character, what we want to do is let's start by going back to the start scene, and let's select our player in our asset panel. Now in the options panel, go ahead and click the checkbox next to physics, and you'll see a drop down appear with dynamic selected. Dynamic is exactly what we need for our asset to be affected by gravity. However, one thing you need to keep in mind is that gravity affects the y-axis. And if you look at our speed attribute, you'll notice that speed is affecting the y-axis. Even though it's set to 0, it's still technically moving it at a 0 speed. So in order for our asset to be affected by gravity, we need to delete this 0 and make sure that the y-axis says none. So now that we did that, let's go ahead and preview, and you'll notice our asset is now moving and falling. Now if I hit refresh, you'll notice that our asset also falls right through the floor. So to prevent this and have the floor be an actual floor, let's go ahead and select our ground asset, and let's click this checkbox next to physics once more. However, this time, instead of dynamic, let's click the drop down and let's select static. What this does is allows this asset to collide with others and not move from its position or be affected by gravity. So if we hit preview at the top, you'll notice that our asset hits the floor and now moves along the floor. So now that we handled physics, let's go ahead and make our asset jump. And to do that, once again, we'll select our character in the asset panel. Then in the options panel, we'll click Add Buildbox, and from there, select Jump. What this does is it allows players to tap or click the screen to make our player jump. So to test this out, once again, let's go ahead and click Preview. And now if you click anywhere on the screen, you'll notice that we're making the asset jump. Now you'll notice that this jump is definitely on the lighter side. For our game, we want the player to feel heavy, so that they have to jump repeatedly in order to avoid the obstacles that we're going to add. To do this, let's go ahead and click My Map at the top in the navigation panel. Then select our 2D world, and from here we actually want to change our gravity setting a bit. So instead of -9.8, let's go ahead and double this to -20. And now let's go ahead and preview. You can see now that our asset definitely feels a lot heavier. However, the jump height is still a little extreme, so we may want to tweak that a little. So to do that, let's go ahead and double click on our 2D world once more. In the asset panel, go ahead and select our player. And now if we look at the jump brain box, we have it set to 20 on the y-axis. So let's go ahead and cut this in half and set it to 10. Now let's go ahead and preview. Now you can see that our jumps are way smaller and it gives more weight to our asset. And it'll definitely make it more challenging for players to avoid the obstacles that we're about to add. Speaking of, now that we have jump and gravity out of the way, it's time to add our enemies. To start adding an enemy, we need to, you guessed it, start adding another asset. So once again, let's head over to our asset library. From here, I'm going to find an asset that looks remotely close to being an enemy. I'm going to go ahead and select this blade asset just because it looks sharp, pointy, and dangerous, and I'm going to go ahead and double click on it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and rename it, and I'm going to replace the name blade with enemy. I'm going to click the drop down to expand it, and from there I'm going to select enemy. After that, I'm going to click the physics checkbox, and just like the ground, I'm going to make this one static. Now in the scene selector at the bottom, let's go ahead and select scene 1. And let's go ahead and drag our enemy into the scene editor. Now my asset's a little small, so I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm going to drag this corner right here. And what shift does is it lets me expand the asset while maintaining its aspect ratio. Alright, and just like that, we have our very first enemy. Let's go ahead and preview and let's see what this looks like. Alright, there it is. And if I hit it, we see our player collide with it. So now that we have our enemy, we definitely want the player to be defeated once it collides with it. To do so, we can use the power of brain boxes once more. So in the asset panel, let's go ahead and select our player. And once again in the options panel, let's go ahead and click add brain box. And this time what we want to look for is health. Let's go ahead and click to apply that. And in its attributes under affected asset, let's go ahead and click the drop down and select enemy. And what this does is it looks for assets that are labeled as enemies, and when our player collides with it, it subtracts from our health. And if you remember from earlier, we set the collision group of our enemy to enemy. So now let's test this out one more time. And if I collide, you notice the player asset is no longer there. Alright, so now that our players are able to be defeated, let's go ahead and add more scenes and change the position of the enemy to make our game a lot more challenging. So in the scene selector at the bottom, let's go ahead and click to select scene 1 and then press D on your keyboard. Next, let's go over to our options panel and let's rename it to scene 2. After that, let's not forget to delete our character. Mine's going to sit in the lower left hand corner. And now I'm going to select scene 2 in our scene selector, and then I'm going to press D once more. And of course, let's not forget to rename it. I'm going to call this one scene 3. And of course, let's delete our character. Now for this one, I'm going to drag our enemy to the lower right hand corner. And again, I'm going to duplicate this scene. Rename this to scene 4 and delete our character. This time I'm going to drag this one directly in the center of the scene. Now from here you can duplicate and create as many scenes as you want and create as much variety as you want. For now I'm going to go ahead and stop at 4 and I'm going to go ahead and hit preview. And we can see we have a random variety and it looks like I died already. So this definitely adds a bit more challenge to the game, but I think we can do better. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to go ahead and select our ground asset from the asset panel. And over by collision group, I'm going to mark this as an enemy. So now if the player hits the enemy or hits the ceiling or the floor, they meet their defeat. And now just to make it a bit more interesting, I'm going to go ahead and go to scene 2. I'm going to select the ceiling right here and I'm going to drag its height down a bit just to give it a bit more of a narrow path. Next I'll go to scene 1 And I'll do the same exact thing to the floor. Alright, now that that's done, let's go ahead and preview this. There we go. There we go, and just to test it, let's go ahead and climb up the ceiling, and looks like I died. So one thing you'll notice when our player collides with the enemy, we're actually being defeated way early before we hit the actual image. The reason why is because its collider is a lot bigger than the actual shape. So to change this is actually quite simple. In the toolbar to the far right, let's go ahead and click this little sphere icon right here. Once you do, you'll notice a bunch of other shapes appear. These are called the collision shapes. When objects hit one another, it's actually the collision shapes that are interacting with one another. So you can see this collision shape on the enemy asset is far larger than the image. So to change this, all we have to do is just drag one of these corners, and I'll drag it so that it meets the edge over here. That should definitely be a lot more fair to the player now, especially since we changed the ground and ceiling to be more narrow. After all, we want to provide more challenge for our players, not torture them. Alright, one thing I do want to point out is once you change the collision shape on an asset, if I go to another scene, you'll notice that the collision shape changes in every place that this asset is used. So you only have to do it once. To hide the collision shapes, simply click the icon in the toolbar once more. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and hit preview once more. And that's definitely a bit more fair. Alright, so the next thing we're going to add is a way for players to collect points as they're dodging our obstacles. To do this, let's go over to the asset library once more. And from here, let's go ahead and find an asset that players can collect. I'm going to go ahead and just pick this flower right here. And of course, the first thing I want to do is rename it. So we're going to go ahead and rename this to point. After that, let's change our collision group to coin. Now that we have our asset, we need to apply specific functionality to it in order to make it add a point. To do this, in the asset panel, let's go ahead and double click on our point asset. In the search bar on the left hand side, let's go ahead and type in point. Click and drag this into the grid to bring in and add point node. The next thing we're going to look for in the search bar is a if collide node. We're going to click and drag and bring that in, and next I'm going to click to bring the start node over here. Then I'm going to connect the created output of the start node to the enabled input of the if collide node. Now that we have our if collide connected to our start node, let's go ahead and connect the collide output to the enabled input of the add point. Now with our if collide selected, if we look at the options panel on the right, let's look for an attribute called affected asset. Now if we click the drop down right here, the asset we want to select is of course our player. So what this is saying is if this asset collides with the player, we're going to add a point. Now once this asset adds a point, I want to get rid of it. To do that, let's go back to the search bar and let's go ahead and type in remove. And we could drag that in over right here. And we could connect the collide output to the enabled input. Now to get out of the node map and return to your 2D world, simply click 2D world in the navigation bar at the top. And now we can start adding our point asset to our scenes. So in scene 2, I'm going to drag it over. And I'm going to put it right about here. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller. Once we have the point asset placed in one of our scenes, we can then press Ctrl Command C to copy it, and then Ctrl Command V to paste it into another scene. Alright, now that we have our points in there, let's go ahead and test it out. And there it is, and there we go. Although we have no visual appearance as to whether or not it's adding the correct score, in order to do that, we actually have to add a UI node in our mind map that'll display exactly what our score is every time we collect points. But first, before we get into that, I want to show you how we can spice up the player's defeat. So in the asset panel, let's go ahead and double click our player to open its node map. And now here, you actually see a lot of different nodes. These are actually the brain boxes. If I click and drag this big square here, I'm clicking and dragging all the nodes associated with this brain box. So what brain boxes are is it's a collection of nodes that are used to perform specific functionalities. So let's go ahead and add something to our defeat. Using the search bar, type debris, then drag in a debris explosion node. And from the defeat output of the defeat node, let's go ahead and connect it to the explosion input of the debris explosion node. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create another asset that we're going to use as a debris. So of course, to do that, let's go back to our 2D world. Let's go to our asset library. And I'm going to go ahead and select flower 1. And for this one, I'm just going to rename this to debris. Now in the navigation bar at the top, click player to go back to its node map. And in the debris explosion node, I'm going to click the little edit icon in the asset square right here. Next, I'm going to find my debris asset. And once I have, I'm going to scroll all the way down and hit save. Now let's go back to our 2D world and test this out. Collide with an enemy and poof! Now what's happening right here is our debris is frozen in place because it actually has no physics. So with our debris selected from the asset panel, let's click the physics checkbox and let's make sure the type is set to dynamic. So now if I test it and I collide with an enemy, boom! We now burst into a bunch of tiny little flowers. Now that we have our level built out and our scenes created, let's go ahead and create our UI overlay to display our current score during gameplay. To do that, I'm going to go back to the mind map by clicking it in the navigation bar at the top. Next, we want to go ahead and drag in a UI screen from the mind map node panel. Once we have that, we can connect the UI output of the 2D world to the load input of the UI screen. This makes it so the UI screen will be overlaid on our 2D world during gameplay. After that, let's go ahead and rename our UI screen in-game menu. Once we have it named, go ahead and double click the UI screen to open the UI editor. And in the UI asset panel, drag in our default font label and place it in the top right corner. Now with our label selected, in the options panel, change the name to score display. Next, change the function attribute from user text to score. And in the amount attribute, set it to current. Now let's go ahead and preview our game. And 1, 2, 3, and our score seems to be working. So the next thing we want to add is something that will send our player to another UI screen once they have been defeated. To do this, we need what's called an event observer. To add an event observer, simply drag it from the UI asset panel into the UI editor. Now this asset does not have any kind of visual appearance. Instead, it sits in a UI editor and waits for an event to occur before sending us to another UI screen or world node. Now if we go back to the mind map, double click the 2D world, then double click on our character asset, you will see that our character has an event node. This is exactly what triggers the event to occur. Right now the event is currently set up as game over, which is exactly what our UI event observer is set to. So now if we go ahead and preview our game and get defeated, the game will then move us to the connected UI screen. And on that note, let's go ahead and create our game over UI. To do so, let's go back to the mind map and drag in another UI screen. We're going to rename this one to game over UI. Now let's go ahead and connect the event observer output of the in-game UI to the load input of the game over UI. Let's now double click to open up the UI editor. And just like the last UI screen, let's go ahead and bring in our label. Now this is going to be the title of our game over screen. So you can either say game over or, of course, my personal favorite, you died. I'm going to go ahead and enlarge it just to make it a little more condescending, and I'm going to center it right about there. Next, we can go ahead and give the label a name, and let's just call it title. Now before we bring in a label to add our score, let's go ahead and include a title right above it. So once again, let's bring in a label and position it to the left, and we're going to call this label best score text. And in the text field, go ahead and type in best score. Now with that label still selected, let's go ahead and press D on our keyboard, then move our new label to the right. Let's go ahead and rewrite the text field to say current score. Now with our current score text selected, hold down Shift on your keyboard and select the best score text, then hit S on your keyboard. Now let's change the name of our new best score text to best score amount. And over in the function attribute, go ahead and select score. And under amount, select best. Now for our current score text label, let's go ahead and change its name to current score amount. Once again, let's set its function to score, but under amount, let's set this one to current. Now to give our players a chance to restart the game once they reach this screen, let's go ahead and drag in a navigation button and let's make it the size of our screen here. Next, let's go ahead and rename it to restart. And after that, change its function to restart as well. And since that concludes our game over UI, let's go ahead and test our game. So we collected 1, collected 2, that's our current, 3 is our current, and we died. So our best is 3, current is 3. We're able to click to restart. And if we lose right here, our current is 0, our best is 3. So that's working perfectly. Alright, now the very last UI that we have to make is just the main menu. So let's head back to the mind map and drag out another UI screen. Change its name to Main Menu UI. And this time, go ahead and connect the Start node to it. Once that's done, go ahead and double click the UI screen to open the UI editor. And from here, we're going to drag in another label and put it at the topmost center. Change the label name to Title, and then in the text field, go ahead and type Jump Avoidance, or of course any title of your choosing. Next, let's go ahead and enlarge it a little, and then press S on your keyboard to duplicate it. Now in the text field on this one, go ahead and type in Tap to Play, and maybe decrease its size so it doesn't contradict with our title. Next, go ahead and drag in a navigation button, and enlarge it so that it takes up the entire screen. And this time, let's head back to the mind map and connect the navigation button output to the load input of the 2D world. And with that final touch, we are ready to test our game for one final time. So when we press play, game opens at our title screen. We're going to go ahead and click the screen to play. And there we have it. Thank you for watching this tutorial on how to make a simple game in Buildbox 3. And of course, for more additional tutorials, visit buildbox.com.